I got a few speakers along, and I said, yeah, you got to do an hour of talking to people about something really interesting. And then when it came to my turn, I actually brought along a couple of former colleagues, Paula and Sue, to help me out. So I don't have to talk as long. It's a little bit naughty, but anyway, here we are. I'm talking about drylands, and I'm going to talk about them in a way that doesn't just focus on biodiversity, because I feel as though that word is becoming a little bit of a dirty word in some communities at the minute. There's me and a researcher in one of the kānuka shrublands on the plains, and I spent about 7 years hanging around these areas, just chilling. I was actually researching, wasn't just chilling. Now I wonder if I can do this. I'm just going to go old-fashioned. So my mum always told me to start with the bad news first, and this is no surprise to anybody that the Indigenous vegetation cover of New Zealand has decreased dramatically in recent times. But how have we done in Canterbury? And again, sorry, let me put this into perspective for you. I know your culture, and so I'd like to describe our loss in international rugby pitches. So between 2012 and 2018, we lost about 13,000 of these areas in native vegetation cover. There we go, thank you. I am an import, but I learn fast. How did we do in Canterbury? Not really that great, just behind Southland. And again, this is from 2012 to 2018. But what are we losing? And you know, this is a little glimmer of hope. So we lost a lot of forest between 95 and about 2008, but then we shot up and we had this dramatic increase in forest cover, which, you know, it's a huge pat on the back for us. We've been doing some hard work. And there was a wee decrease between 2012 and 2018, but it's not that dissimilar to what we had in 95. So do you know what? Well done us. We're doing some good stuff. Can everyone hear me? Yeah. But it's not the case for every type of vegetation. So here we've got tussock grassland, which declined quite a lot from 1995. But when we get to this latter period from 2012 to 2018, kind of levels off a bit. So we're not declining quite as much, but still declining. And when we look at other herbaceous vegetation, it's a similar story. Dramatic decline, and then we're plateauing, and so, you know, we're really trying to make an effort here. And then let's look at shrubland. It's a completely different story, and so we were actually increasing, and then something happened around sort of 2008, and we had this dramatic decrease in shrubland cover. And we were notable. We were noteworthy for our loss of grey scrub in Canterbury, losing 2.3%. However, if we look at the next sentence there, Marlborough, they lost 24.2%. So, you know, we're not that bad, are we? We've all seen this before. And this is a map showing how much Indigenous land cover is left. And I just wanted to put this, the Marlborough number, into context next to our Canterbury number. So the red is where there's not much native land cover left. And it's interesting that it's in these low, warmer places where we've lost a lot of our Indigenous vegetation. In the steep, colder places, we've managed to actually protect quite a lot. So if we look at where Marlborough is, we've got quite a lot of green there. So the green means that there's over 30% of native vegetation cover, and over 20% is protected. Go Marlborough. But let's think about that a bit more clearly, and I like to put it into the context of my house. So if somebody came to me and said, hey, do you know what? I am delighted to tell you you've got more than 30% of your house left. In fact, you got 50%. So I'd probably have to think about what I'd like to keep, and I'd probably go for the kitchen, the bathroom, probably the living area, because we could probably sleep in there. The bedrooms are gone. Bedrooms are gone. Sorry, kids. They're gone. But I'm only going to be able to insure 30% of it. Don't know, I'll probably insure, I think I'd have a shower, maybe the toilet, maybe an oven. Sounds really weird, hey. So Marlborough's doing great, but not that great. And then we come down to us here in Canterbury, and we're really red, which means that we've got less than 10%. And 10% of a house, I don't know what I'd choose of that. I'd probably just go and live in the forest. So anyway, who cares? Who cares? Why am I banging on about this? You know, what have shrublands got to offer us? They're dry areas, and we've been doing quite well at putting the forest back. We all love a tree. I love trees. And I've tricked you again here because up here we have the Ewell Scientific Reserve, which is a shrubland. Here, you might have picked that up actually, is a kānuka shrubland, although it looks a little bit forestry. I tried to trick you. And this moss behind as well, this gorgeous carpet of moss, it is also in a shrubland. And I think it's quite obvious that I care about Drylands, and I'm sure actually that many of you do here in this room. But what is a shrubland? So lots of people have been putting their heads together for quite some time to try and define the different types of shrubland that we have across the whole country. And we've got quite a few different types in Canterbury. The one that I probably spent the most time in was the top one, the kānuka shrubland with caprosma and prickly mingy. However, the description, the distribution says that it's mainly in Nelson and Marlborough, and that's because a lot of the vegetation plots to try and describe the shrubland, there weren't many in our area. So why do I love them? They're really biodiverse. And I said that I wasn't going to concentrate on that, but just really, really quickly, up there we've got a moss carpet with a rare herb growing through it. We've got this beautiful jeweled gecko on a prostrate kowhai in the middle, and it's so cute. Here we've got pomaderris, and this plant is at its southernmost distribution in our district. And in fact, a colleague of mine did some research on this and tried to figure out if this species, this plant, was the same as what we had on the North Island. And she found that there were some differences, and so potentially we've got a new species that's just found in our district. There's rare invertebrates, we've got orchids, we've got Leptocophila juniperina, which is my delightful nemesis, and this is a story for another time. I love it and I hate it all at the same time. And of course we've got kānuka. Now this, I spent so much time in these areas, probably not as much time as some of you, I imagine, but I love this plant, and not just because it smells lovely and it has flowers at Christmas, and you get honey from it, all of those things, but also because it supports other biodiversity. So kānuka is a host species to beneficial fungi that support other plants. Mycorrhiza, it supports ectomycorrhiza. This is fungi that coats the roots, and also arbuscular mycorrhizae, which is fungi that actually infiltrates the roots. And other plant species can tap into this, so it kind of shares stuff with other plants. Anyone who came to Anisha's talk will have seen a lot of this stuff before. Basically, the fungi is like a telephone wire between different plants. The fungi gets sugar and carbon, and in return it gives the plants nutrients and water and helps everyone survive. It's a happy family. just one last thing on biodiversity. I found this diagram and I really liked it. It has biodiversity in the middle. Biodiversity being the collection of organisms that make up an ecosystem. Biodiversity, all of those organisms working together make the ecosystems function, and in return they do ecosystem services for us, which we then take. These are things that we can tap into, and then us in turn, we affect global change, and the cycle starts again, and we affect the biodiversity, which in turn affects the ecosystem functions. We're part of this cycle of nature. So, ecosystem services. I'm sure that many people have at least heard of the term, if not know the term inside out and back to front. But in about 2005, the United Nations produced a report which defined these terms, and basically they're the things that we can take from the ecosystems, and often we take them for granted. So provision in services, the actual things that we take, so the wood, the food, the water, regulating things that, services that regulate the environment, so regulating the air that we breathe, our fresh water, protecting us against disease and pests. Cultural, the things that that we do take for granted, and it reminds me of that. I saw a poster which said, what is Earth without art? Just E and H, And we kind of take that stuff for granted, I believe, but it is integral. The environment is integral. I can't say that word, you know what I'm trying to say, to our mental and physical health. We get spiritual values from the environment, recreation, etc. And then supporting the services that help us gain all of these other services. So what are the services that we get from Drylands? We get wood. Oh my gosh, kānuka. If you came to Tim's talk a few weeks ago, you'll know that kānuka is actually quite flammable. And so it's brilliant to put on your fire. It's really strong. Kānuka is really strong and durable, and it was often used around par sites. It was also used as fences in watercourses to trap tuna, and then the tuna was split and dried on the kānuka poles, and this makes me think of smoking fish as well. I'm sure that if you use the charcoal from kānuka and manuka, it has that lovely kānuka-y, manuka-y smell and taste. Kānuka and manuka essential oils are really prized around the world, and if I'm honest, I use kānuka oil on my children because it does everything that eucalyptus oil does, but it's really, really gentle. I don't know if anyone's interested. I brought in my kānuka oil, so feel free to pass it around and give it a smell if you'd like to. The kānuka oil is taken from the leaves and the stems. It's also, breathing in these volatile chemicals is actually really good for our mental health, because when we breathe them in, they go straight past our blood-brain barrier and straight into our emotional centre in our brain. I think that's why I enjoyed the hanging around in the kānuka shrubland so much. Plant compounds in medicine, and they've actually found that a plant compound in manuka can disrupt the reproduction of MRSA, the hospital superbug. And so we get all of these medicines from these plants that are in our drylands, in our district. Not to mention honey. So there was some research that came out in about 2012 that looked at the unique manuka factor in manuka honey, UMF. And they found that kānuka honey actually had more UMF than the manuka honey. Now this is still a little bit up for debate, but our kānuka is up there with the honey, which is sold for so much money around the world. And I found out the other day that even better than manuka honey is Discaria honey, so Mcgaw. Apparently it's like gold, and it's very creamy, and it's sold for more than manuka, another dryland plant. As well as food for us, food for stock. So some of my colleagues at Lincoln University took the chemical profiles of quite a few different plants, and they were trying to show that you can use some of our dryland plants as a stock feed to top up micronutrients that may be missing in the diet. They'll never replace lolium, our ryegrass, because that's so nitrogen rich. However, some of these micronutrients, over here we've got kunzia, our kānuka, which actually has quite a lot of zinc in it, and also flax, Formium tenax, which also has quite a lot of zinc in it, much more than our ryegrass. Tannins, so our kānuka also has a lot of tannins in, and tannins really help with the absorption of protein in stock. And so there's potential for these dryland plants that sometimes are seen as a bit of a pain, or at least have been in the past. These dryland plants actually offer something more to us than biodiversity. Regulating services, so pollination and pest disease. So our kānuka stands are incredibly rich in invertebrates, and I'm going to pass something else around which normally sits on the desk next to my son's computer, and it's a wee trapdoor spider. Just thought it'd be nice to have a look at it. They're such incredible creatures. Have a go. I hope no one's scared of spiders. But you know, some of these invertebrates are amazing pollinators. So we have a lot of beetles, a lot of butterflies and moths and flies, which help with pollination. We also have some invertebrates which will help with control your gorse. So the lemon tree borer and the gorse stem miner, the larvae will rip up the gorse stems, and completely by accident, a parasitoid fly that lives in our kānuka shrublands, it was found that their larvae actually get into the grass scrubs and burst open the grass scrubs. And so these are only the things that we know about. And a colleague of mine from Lincoln University a few years ago took a net and swept it through a hedge. And it sounds like I'm making it up, but he found a new species just in a very simple act of sweeping through a hedge. And so we're forever finding new animals in this country. And so who knows what else is out there and what else we're missing. Regulating climate and carbon sequestration. So there's a lot of debate at the minute about how much carbon native species can actually take from the atmosphere and lock up. And the data here is actually quite old, but if you see low productivity radiata pine is very similar to what we're getting in a manuka and kānuka shrubland or low forest. And I took these wee graphs from Carbon Crop, New Zealand, a website. This is radiata pine over 50 years, so we have this sharp increase in carbon uptake, and that's because young trees take in a lot of carbon. Then the stand is thinned, and it drops a little bit and then increases again over time. Similar for Douglas fir without the thinning, but our kānuka and manuka stands also do the same thing. We just take a little bit more time to get there. Another colleague of mine was interested in kānuka and the effects on the below ground activity. And what she did is she took patches of bare soil and then kānuka, just a kānuka plant in the same area. She poured water over the bare soil and the kānuka, and then for others she poured dairy effluent, which is obviously very high in nitrogen. And what she found, nice to have a pointer here, so the dotted black line is just the bare soil, and the dotted green line is the bare soil, both of them with dairy effluent. If you notice where the kānuka is present, there's hardly any nitrous oxide being thrown up into the atmosphere. Nitrous oxide is an incredibly powerful gas which is causing climate change, much more so than CO2. And so what she found was that the kānuka was putting what we call plant exudates, so pumping chemicals into the soil, which prevented the microbes from changing the nitrogen into this harmful nitrogen gas. It suppressed it. And so just planting kānuka, you could be having an effect on climate change positively. It regulates water. We all know that plants have this filtration effect through the roots. Small plants have small root systems generally. When we look at our larger, unfortunately I couldn't find a picture of kānuka roots, and so we just have to pretend that this is kānuka. You know, these wide-ranging root systems of our shrubs, they take out a lot of the nutrients from our water and kind of purify it for us. Cultural services, the ones that we take for granted. I'm not going to talk very much about this because I feel as though we all innately know what we get from our natural environments, and very much so from dryland areas. There's been numerous studies to show that just even looking at a picture of something natural brightens up our day. In fact, there was one study that showed that walking in a city as opposed to walking by a river or a watercourse, if you walk by a river for 10 minutes a day, you will have lower cortisol levels, your stress hormone, you will have lower blood pressure, lower heart rate, and be generally much more healthy. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. It's incredibly important for mental health that we get outside. We all know that. With COVID, we all took our exercise. Supporting, so nutrient cycling. This is a study from Auckland where they looked at 4 different species and they looked at how much carbon was being locked up. Now this is quite a big, extensive data set, but what I want you to look at is this bit here and this bit here. So the carbon that is locked up in kānuka is actually higher than some of the other species. But also, if you look at that organic layer carbon concentration, it's really high. And kānuka and quite a few of our native plants actually pump carbon into the soil at rates that we don't really see in the UK. It's quite astonishing. And so these plants are actively making sure that they're regulating our climate for us. Now this is just a really brief note on the nitrogen cycle. And this is so that I can talk about the nitrogen cycle with our dryland plants. So we've got nitrogen in the atmosphere, and it's fixed using these little symbols. That's my symbol for microbes. And so plants can fix nitrogen into the soil using microbes. Again, if you came to Anisha's talk, he spoke a lot about rhizobia, which are these microbes that do that. Also, lightning strikes can fix nitrogen into the soil. When plants decompose, they give nitrogen to the soil. And it's often in a form called ammonium, which can also be uptaken by plants. However, if it's not uptaken by plants, microbes then convert it into nitrite for a very small amount of time, and then into nitrates. We all know about nitrate. This can be uptaken by the plants, it can be leached into our waterways, or it can be lost from the soil and go back into the atmosphere and often into that harmful nitrous oxide gas. So the key points here are these little fellas. Here we've got our own native nitrogen fixing plants. We've got sophora or kowhai, we've got discaria or matagari, and we've got Karmakelia or our native broom. And they're such amazing plants, and they're all really pretty. And discaria gives amazing honey. And like I say, they fix them by these little root nodules. They have microbes in them that take the nitrogen and fix it into the soil. It's a little bit like ecological magic. Now, some of our native plants also have luxury uptake, particularly of nitrogen. So they take in a lot more nitrogen than they need, but they hold on to it. They don't drop their litter very readily, and when they do, they recycle those nutrients. And so here is just some research that was done on the uptake of nitrogen by another colleague. And as you can see, our ryegrass takes in nitrogen and it kind of plateaus out. But for, at the top there, for our mānuka, for flax, for kānuka, for toitoi, for archaic species, they're taking in a lot more nitrogen than they need. And so these species could be used to clean up some of the areas where there's a lot of nitrogen being put into the soil. This is one of my favorite soil science diagrams ever. And I'm such a soil geek. So I want you to get excited about it as well. So here we've got the pH of the soil along the bottom. And then we have all of the elements. And the size is how much you can get of that element at that pH. And so as you can see, most elements, or the ones we want, are freely available around sort of 6.5. A lot of our dryland sites are down here. We're quite acidic in many of the dryland areas. However, if you weren't trying to maintain that acidity and maintain that dryland habitat, if say you wanted a field boundary with a lot of different species, you could add in some litter, leaf litter from some of our native species, such as kānuka, such as our kowhai, and it actually increases the pH. So what we have here is different amounts of leaf litter from different plants that were mixed into soil and then left. They were incubated to see what would happen to the soil over time. And interestingly, kowhai, the second one, microphylla. So when you mixed in just 0.5 grams of leaf litter, you got a soil pH of slightly above 5. If you increase it to 1 gram, you got 5.6 and so on. And it was the same for kānuka, which is very interesting when you consider that in these drylands we have acidic soils. Soil protection. So where we've got soil erosion, which is really common in New Zealand and particularly for us in Canterbury, if we cover it with our plants, the soil's going to remain. This research was showing the root morphology of lots of different plants. And as you can see, it acts as fingers. We all know this. It pins down the soil. It also helps with that filtration of water through the roots. These species here are cabbage tree, flax, toitoi, kānuka. We've got kōhuhu, Caprosna, kānuka, kōhuhu. All of those plants actually do the luxury uptake thing as well, and so they've got lots of very thin roots as well, particularly for our monocots, so the very leafy plants at the top, and they take up luxury nitrogen and can be used to clean up our soil water. There's some more. I just love soil and roots. So that's my spiel on how amazing dryland plants are and the amount of different things that we can get from them, what they can do for us. And I mean, I'm astounded by some of these native plants and the magic that they have. So if we bring it back, we all know this picture, very similar to the one that I showed before. However, this is showing, instead of this being red and it being native vegetation cover, this is where we have agricultural land, tussock land, indigenous forests, etc. And a lot of the agricultural land is again in those low-lying areas. But we need space. We need space for people and agriculture and nature. And so how are we going to do it? So I'm just going to touch on briefly a little bit of research that I did a few years ago. And it's just something to think about. Novel ways that we can approach this question. So I had a look at different kānuka stands in the Waimakariri district. I looked at some remnants. I looked at a lot of field boundaries. And I looked at kānuka, which at the time was still remaining under the Iwa forest. And it was no surprise to me that we got a lot of native species in our remnant areas. And also in our remnant areas, they were quite nutrient poor. In our field boundaries, we got a lot of species, but a lot of them were exotic because of the edge effects. And those areas were quite nutrient rich comparably. And again, they were next to agricultural land, which is being fertilized, so no surprise there. In the pine area, it was kind of an intermediate. We had a few native species, but there weren't many plants to keep seeding into that area. And the soil nutrition was pretty low. But the thing that really got me thinking were these big blue lines here. That's soil moisture. So the soil moisture between these dry land reserves and our grassland field boundaries, which were receiving irrigation from pivots, were really similar. An area receiving irrigation and our reserves. And so I went and had a wee look at them. Sorry, I've just realised that I think my slides might be out of order, but we'll carry on. So I went and had a look a little bit more closely at the reserves and found that in the reserves there was this thick carpet of moss. This is the slide I wanted. A really thick carpet of moss, and I drew a line on a graph, and it was a beautiful red line which showed that the more cover of bryophytes you had, the more cover of native plants. And that should have been my PhD. Absolutely done. Thank you and good night. But it's not that easy. I started thinking, it's just fluke that the moss is growing in the same place as the plants. Or maybe the moss is just saying, hey, there's been no disturbance here. Or maybe the moss was doing something a little bit more interesting. And so I started to have a little closer look. The background to this is that I did some work in the Arctic, and we did work with moss, and we found that in the Arctic, moss is super duper important, and it's almost an environmental engineer, and it's the same in many of the dryland areas around the world. And so I was kind of hoping it was going to be the latter. I'm going to go back now to the slide. Oh no, I'll stick here. So I started looking at what the moss was doing to the soil temperature and moisture levels. Now I don't know how much you know about moss, but it's non-vascular, so it doesn't have any roots. It just kind of sits there on the soil and takes whatever it can, so it gets its moisture and its nutrients from the environment. And this moss was just sitting there minding its own business, and it was actually keeping the soil temperature steady. So where we had bare soil, there were these big fluctuations in temperature in both summer and winter, and where the moss cover was, it was just ameliorating that fluctuating effect. And the same thing for moisture as well. So where we had bare soil, there was this big range between summer and winter, you know, winter wet, summer dry. Whereas when we started to get moss cover, that range was a lot smaller. And so it was just, you know, keeping everything steady and balanced. And then I started to look at the nitrogen, and that's when it got really interesting, because what I found was bare soil and then different depths of moss going this way. And this is a scale for the concentration of nitrates or ammonium. Our black dots are ammonium. Mosses are really, really good at taking up ammonium. And what they were doing is in winter, when they were active, the mosses were taking up all the nitrogen that they could and stopping it going to the soil underneath. And so bare soil, we got a fair bit of ammonium. As soon as we add mosses into the system, the ammonium in the soil drops because the moss is doing its work. Actually kicks back up a little bit here due to the fact that the deeper the moss, the more dead layers you get underneath, and so the live moss can't take anything from the soil. Nitrates was a similar story, but it was always very low. But if you remember back to that nitrogen diagram, if we're taking all of the ammonium, what's going to turn into nitrate? So, it's pretty exciting stuff. The moss is making sure that the temperature is stable, it's making sure that the water is stable, it's making sure that these areas don't have loads of nitrogen in them. I'm going to flick back to this one. So I had looked at it in the field, I looked at 2 different reserves, and we did transects from the edge of the reserve into the centre, and I measured soil parameters, and we did vegetation plots as well. And it was absolutely textbook. What we found was not that, oh my gosh, I don't know how that's jumped so much, excuse me. Textbook. What we found was that as we walked into the centre of the reserve, the soil nutrients decreased. They were higher at the edge, and that was the same for the grass litter as well. The moss was the inverse, so the more we walked into the reserve, the more the moss cover increased. And so the moss not only was being outcompeted by the grass, but it was also playing into this role of the lower nutrients down here. Moss also has antimicrobial properties, a bit like we talked about with the kānuka, where it can kind of stop those microbes doing their work to transform ammonium into nitrate, which feeds back into that graph that we saw before. However, what does all of this mean, and why am I going on about it? How can we use our native plants in our environment, particularly our agricultural environment? And that means for biodiversity, but also for us in agriculture. Oh my gosh. Apologies. So I came up with this diagram. So for our remnant areas, we're going to need to buffer them. It's quite obvious that the nutrients around the side are allowing these grasses to encroach into the reserve areas and killing our moss, which is actually governing the ecosystem functions of those areas. And so we could have a buffer, and we could plant it with some of those amazing plants that we talked about before. The kānuka that stops the microbial activity, the flax that really uptakes all of that nitrogen. And then eventually we'd have this moss layer coming back, and we'd have healthy dryland kānuka shrublands. And this here is a soak-away pit, and this is where you dig a trench and backfill it with stones, with the thinking that nutrients will flow along and then disappear down the trench. We tried it in a few different areas, and I was looking through the data today, and it doesn't really show that it works. We've still got some more research to do on that. But I think the more that we put together these ideas, novel ideas and crazy out there ideas, the more we can have our remnants living really happily in our agricultural areas. Oh, wrong way. And so what can we use these plants for in the agricultural areas for the benefit of the agricultural areas? Here are a few examples. So there's a fenced paddock, border with a ditch with beautiful planting along, which will obviously stop any cattle going in. Most of these are fenced throughout our district. However, planting them up will also catch all of those nutrients. There's cabbage trees, there's carex. Those plants that uptake a lot of those nutrients. Planted areas between pivots and under pivot planting, which is beautiful to see out on the Canterbury Plains. I've seen quite a lot of it popping up just lately, which is just wonderful to see. Not only giving shelter for stock and potential fodder for those micronutrients, but also just breaking up that environment. Areas of native plants that do the luxury uptake, where we can put dairy effluent. And so those plants are cleaning the soil for us. You know, we're not just flushing it away, we're actually putting it on plants and using the plants to do the job for us. Using native plants for shade, for stock, easy, and planted field boundaries. And they're just a few ideas. There's so many more. And like I say, I think we're in a position at the minute where we're coming up with novel ideas, novel farming techniques, novel restoration techniques. And so there's going to be hundreds of these coming out in the next few years. And how can we get our native plants into our urban environment? You have to come back in 2 weeks' time and listen to Colin, who is going to be talking all about that. That's going to be a great talk. And so I'm going to stop talking now because I've been talking for ages. But just to leave you with these thoughts that, you know, we as ecologists need to make sure that our remnants are as resilient as we possibly can. And that means including a whole suite of species, including non-vascular species and things that maybe we don't really think that much of. We need to have a really clear understanding of the links between what's going on in the soil and what's going on above the ground. And we need to try and unite these two, this interface of our farming environments and our biodiversity remnants. We need to somehow integrate them. And that's a challenge for every single one of us, I do believe. So I'm going to shut up. I feel as though I've done a real whistle-stop tour, and I'm going to introduce Sue Mcgaw. Now, I worked with Sue at Lincoln when she was doing her master's, and she's a wonderful ecologist, Dryland ecologist, who's done a lot of work in our district. Thank you. Are you okay doing this?
Oh, no, just tell me which button do I press.
I'm sorry, I made a big zero of it. So just that one.
Oh, yeah.
Just clicking.
Oh, thanks. All right, what have we got
Just
here?
put the lights up because you were complaining.
Well, of course, so I'm Sue Mcgaw, and I've been working out in the field for lots and lots of years, actually since I was 28, and I'm just about to hit the 69, so that's a few years. So in the last 18 months, I've probably overseen about 14,000 plants into projects, mostly dryland projects. And the two things that I'm really passionate about is, one, I want 99% survival. If you're going to do all that work, we want everything to survive. So it has to be 99% plus. And the other thing that I'm really excited about is lots of plant species. So Bex has talked about, you know, we've lost so many, there's very little remnant left on the Canterbury Plains, but that's not going to stop us because we've got work to do. We want to give more planting. And so what I do when I'm about to start a new project. So I was going to work on the edge of the Waiau, but I'm currently working near Mcgaw at the moment, and last month it was the upper Rakaia doing lizard habitat. But what I do is I go out with my camera and take photos, and I find as many plant species in the area that I'm going to be working in, but also I take a picture like this. And so what have we got here? We've got all these red berries of the Carokia, and then there's a little bit of porcupine shrub in there, and then there'll be some well, of course there's going to be Mcgaw, and then you've got that whole line of either the South Island kowhai or the low kowhai, and of course the kānuka up there. And then what do? You go and put that piece into your project. And the thing about these plants is they're kind of like family. So you take the snapshot of what you see, and you realize that plants kind of like to be growing next to each other. And you start to learn which plants like to be growing next to each other. And so that's how you start to build up your plant list. And I think many a time people think, oh, if I've got water on my property, I have to do riparian planting. No. We're in Waimakariri and Huranui, and places like this, lots and lots of stones. Has anybody got a stony property? Yeah, stony property. So we're not going to go and plant all those swamp plants that have got the centre of Christchurch, because they're just not going to work. So what we do is go out with our eyes, go up the Waipara Gorge. You can go up there on the way. Has anyone been to the sculpture park? Yeah, well, before you get there, there's a little pull-off on the side of the road. You just stop there and you look up, and you've got the whole example of what you need to be planting right in front of you. And you just take that as inspiration and take it back into your stony little spot. Now I have to find the next button. Here we go. Now that's that same picture, and you can see here's those same plants, and there's the Huranui River, and down there things like sandcoprosmas and porcupine shrubs and Melicitus crassifolius. So quite often there's all these extra plants that you don't particularly know about. There's quite a few there. But anyway, so the two things that I get passionate about is I want my plants to survive. I want to choose the right plants. And the other things, I want my plant list to be representative of what could happen. And nurseries are a business, so sometimes they're not going to have all these plants, but that's not to say we can't have them in our projects. So what we do is we work to find a way to have them in our projects. So people like Andrew, who's sitting at the back there from Goff's Nurseries, I'll take him some plant material, seeds or some cuttings. He will propagate them on, and then we'll bring them back into our projects, into the area, the district that remnant should be from. And we start to really get some of those biodiversity services happening that Bex has been talking about. And I'm going to talk about biodiversity services in this respect. So we've got a project and we want to plant, and we think, right, we want bird food and we want lizard food and we want insects and all the rest. Well, it's really important when we're making our plant list that we think about winter bird food. So many times I see projects where this whole issue of what happens in winter is not even thought about. So it's worth thinking about, well, what do I want if I want to do some planting? Am I just going to be a person who does native gardening? Any native plant will do. And the way I teach, so I've got a lot of students who've been working for me over the last 4 months who've come to have some experiences on all the projects that I'm doing. And I explained to them, you can't just have any old plant. You can't just go along and say, well, if it's a native, I'll use that, must be good. You've got to think about, you can't have those North Islanders, you can't have those Stewart Islanders, you can't have those crossbreeds. And the way we think about it is this: if I had a beautiful fruit bowl and I put it on your counter, and then I went to the fridge and I pull out the top and I put it on the fruit bowl, I could say, well, it's all food and it's all raw food. What's wrong with that? You know, that's okay. So, and you might think, well, you can't put that chop in that fruit. And I say, well, why not? It's all food. So it's the same with when we're constructing a native revegetation or a restoration planting, or a planting that we want it to do something good for us. We can't put that chop in the fruit bowl. We just want fruit, and we just want fruit that's going to be nutritious and useful. So that's why we don't use North Island plants and South Island and Deep South plants and offshore plants and crossbreed plants. But we do make an effort to go to places like this. Now I love this picture. I'm sorry it's not wonderful close, but that's press the button. Okay. There's no stick, is there? Okay, so the way to Hemna is along there. That's the Hemna Road. And this, at the top there, that's the Waiau River, Waiau Ufa. And my planting was sort of all the way around. See those numbers? Sort of around there. That's all Dryland terrace. What happens if I want to go back, Bex? Help me. Yeah, that's it. So this picture was taken about 4 kilometres from that property beside the Waiau Ufa. And I really love that because you go in there and on the right is Olearia avicennifolia and Olearia paniculata. There's a cabbage tree up the top, there's a flax up the top, there's lots of the hebe, now called Veronica traversi, and all around the Huranui and all around the edges of the Waimakariri is this hebe, Veronica traversi. And that's one of the ones that we collect propagation material from, propagate it, and it's back into the project already. And on up the top there, there's Ozothamnus, that's the golden cottonwood, there's Manuka, Kānuka, I mentioned the Olearia avicennifolia, and a great wealth of plants, just all in this one little cameo. And then I scramble up the bank, go over the road, go down the bank on the other side, and then I've got 5-finger mahoi, fuchsia, Coprosma robusta, and all that little thing happening. And then I'll go another 20 metres, and all this is within max 70 metres, and then I'll get that mix there, which is the kowhai and the Mcgaw and the Coprosma propinqua. So within quite a short space of place, nearby to the river, on the terraces, I've got 3 quite different little plant communities. And so that's another thing that I think is really exciting about what you can do with your projects, is have a close look at the little banks or the little terraces or the rises and the falls, and you can really start to get that bigger vision going of a larger species list. And they don't have to be all tall trees. We're talking shrublands as well here, and we're talking about the ground, the below knee level, which Bex has just explained to us is so important. Can you press that button? Thank you. And the next one. Oh, no, go back. Can you go back one? Sure. I think what's so exciting about doing a project like this Lockerbie farm, which was about 3,500 plants, I think we've lost 26 at the most. And the Waiau burst its banks. I'm really crack the whip and say you must plant it like this, and if you don't, you have do it again, and you have to put the combi guards on just so. But the thing is, that river went to 1600 kumiks, it burst its bank, it flooded. Our plants were fine. We had to sit a few up and go along with the kitchen fork and the brush and sort of just, there, up you come. But we didn't lose any because the job was done properly. But what I like is that we gave a name to every single area that we did. And Nohoanga, place to sit, that's where John Faulkner started. But the top one, Te Wahi o Te Hononga, what happened was we were working there. John brought his baby down in the front sack. We had 9 and 11-year-olds come who were doing home schooling. We had their parents and their uncle and aunts turn up for lunch. I had my granddaughter and my grandson and my daughter came down from Blenheim sometime. We had students. We had various other people of all sorts. But the thing is that we would meet and we would work together. And I think this is another really important aspect of doing a project and doing this on your own property, leaving some legacy, coming together, doing something together, creating something that's worthwhile and special. And so that's why we named that Te Wahi o Te Hononga, and everything else got another name because it was special in some form. Can you carry on? You can shut me up when you think of. So
maybe 5 more minutes, if that's all right.
yes. So tips for success. So researching. I'm just wondering if this is. Well, it's really important to do your planning properly. This is a good thing, and there's reasons why things don't. How do I get 99% survival? Well, planning, incorrect plant choices. Again, I've just briefly touched on this. Don't put the top on the fruit bowl, and think about family groups, what plants actually go together. Many plants are not placed in the right place, the dry plants in the wet places, the wet plants in the dry places. Underperforming planting techniques, it makes a big difference if you take a lot of care and do things, and insufficient, uninformed or careless after care. So with my Dryland experiment that I did on that previous Lockerbie thing, we had 150 Dryland plants. We had 6 species, and they were all the wriggly sort of things that we've talked about already today. And we only lost, over 18 months, we only lost 5 out of 150. Absolutely, totally stony, rubbishy rubbish. No protection whatsoever, no water whatsoever, in the full blast of everything the Hemner wave direction was going to throw at us. And we lost only 5. We lost 1 to wasp nest, 2 to rabbits, and 2 for plants that weren't put in the ground initially in firm enough. So they oscillated and put pressure on the roots, and they died. So we could have done something about those 2. We can carry on here. So I'm just going to, that's my hazard talk at the top. Don't worry about that. Handle it only once. It's really important when I'm doing planning. I'm thinking, right, I want access ways, I want groups for my plants, I want the maintenance to be reduced over time, I want my maintenance to be access to be really fast. So if I'm going to go past something and it's a coat hanger branch at this height, it's going to be lopped off the first time I go past, not a second time. And so I always think REP. So repair, revegetation, restoration, regeneration, research, education is really important. As evenings like this, putting ideas into your head, making you think, oh, okay, I hadn't thought that kānuka was so useful and those low-growing things, and perhaps I can make a difference. And wouldn't it be lovely if I had a stand of kānuka on my property, and I could just go in there with my glass of wine and sit back and smell it, and just enjoy it. And my kids can come round, and we'll, maybe my grandkids and I will do a bit of planting, every few weeks or something. And so planning potential, and you have to have pleasure in the jobs that you do, and the legacy that you leave with our Drylands. And there's so much more that we can talk about Drylands. Is that it? There? Do we have a picture back at the beginning? And I do have some cards here, but I'm very grateful to Andrew Goff too, who's come tonight, because he has helped me really start to get those extra species that we want to plant in many of these places. So he's prepared to propagate them on for me when I want my plant list to look like this, not like this. So thank you very much, people.
And another former colleague of mine, Paula Greer, who we spent many a hot day out on the Canterbury Plains down here in the Waimakariri, is going to talk about some of her research.
Okay, I know a few faces here, people who've probably heard most of this talk before. As part of my Masters, before I did my Masters, I helped Bex with her PhD, as you said, lovely hot days amongst pine and kānuka forests. It's quite interesting how different they were. And then freezing cold days when you're trying to spread a mix of glue and moss to see if it will grow and establish. It didn't, unfortunately. So I'm going to do a slightly different talk. I actually working out at Herewell, I looked at the dams, which I'm sure most of you have seen. How you do it?
Try and tap to the top left. It's the left button rather than the right.
Okay, this is one of the dams out at Herewell. Pretty much the 3 years I worked there was 2014 to 2016, so 3 years of drought pretty much. And I think this was probably towards the end of it, so we had some rain and you can see some vegetation, but a lot of the time there wasn't, and you're just looking at basically rocks and stones that have been put in, and a few lovely weeds that would, everyone knows them, you've seen them around, acerola, and a few others, verbascum, that just take off everywhere. And I don't know if anyone of you have heard, late 1880s, 1870s in Kew, someone had this brilliant idea, or set up an experiment of glass bottles with a variety of common weed seeds in them, bury them in upside down, so they supposedly maintain a fairly sterile environment, and then we'll dig up so many every, I think it's 10 years for the first 50 years, and I think it's down to 5 years now. Verbascum, they pulled one out 2 years ago it must be now, and verbascum seeds were still germinating. Out of the 100 different species they had at verbascum was still germinating.
Sorry, how long was that?
Over 100 years, I think it's up to 120 now. So, and they've got, I think, 2 more bottles to go. So it's, it will survive, so pull it out as much as you can. I'll leave them. Okay, so I looked at, I did plan to look at 5 different dryland species, all turned out to be ground covers because that was available. 2 of them, as you can see, Leptonella cerulata. You do, actually incredibly hard to see. But you actually have to start looking for the form of the leaf. It's just that slight little fern thing in between the two twigs here. And then Monroy, Rowlea Monroy, it's quite a different sort for the Rowleas because it opens more like a fan instead of a spiral. So they're actually quite cryptic species. The interesting thing is they're pretty much from the beaches to subalpine, so they'll grow anywhere within the plains pretty much. But I looked at the roots, and as you can see, even though it's a tiny amount of plant that you actually see, there's a huge amount of roots. Because on dams, you want something to hold the soil together, but you don't want something that will create great big holes in it. And these were available through the nurseries that I could get. The other one was Mudenbeckia freudes. A lot of you might have seen it. Looks like a dried twig is up the top here, but it can form quite large patches. I think that one was only about 3 metres across. If you go down to Dagenham, down by the river of Dog Trail Road, it's basically a paddock between the pines down there. It has a couple of patches. One I think is about 4 metres long, and it's about 20-30 centimetres high in depth. It's quite an amazing plant because you wouldn't think it's actually alive. It has very few leaves. Okay, so this is just initial to show variety of altitudes. This is based on NIVS. NIVS data is available through the internet to anyone pretty much. Anyone can log in, you don't have to belong to any fantastic company. And that will give you data of all the species that Tier 1 survey every year. So they do a survey, I think it's 8 square kilometres in certain points throughout the whole country on obviously land, and they count all the species there, how much vegetation, and that's plants, animals, birds, everything that they can. So it's just to overview of the plants I was looking at. Okay, what I used was basically just your standard scanner, but it's flipped upside down, and the roots were cut up and put in a tray of water, and you got these lovely pictures, and the program basically scanned it, counted pretty much every minute millimetre that there was possible, and it's like most of this is thinner than your hair, so it's very, very fine roots, and it's just interesting to see how different it was. So this is the average diameter. The first 4 are the native plants I looked at. The rest are all the common weeds I found on the dams. So you see there's not a huge difference between them. But then when you come to actual root length, so that's a total root length if you joined all the roots together to get it, there is a huge difference. All the natives, there's a lot more roots in there than in the non-natives, and so that means they are actually holding the soil together, they're filling up all the gaps or creating new gaps. But with the density, the natives are actually, it's a lot less density. So if you remember the photos, they're actually quite thin, very narrow roots, most of them. And this is one of the things that I found. Get this little tangle of roots, and it seemed quite strange, and you open it up and you find these fertiliser balls. So it's something to consider when you are planting out, because you're planting into a low fertility area. Actually open the roots out and get rid of a lot of that planting mix, so the plant will actually start spreading. And one of the other problems, subflub as we called it, Spaniard grass. This is a smaller one. Because I was doing the extremes of the dam, so the north facing side and the south facing side, they had the same, I think it's only 4 specimens of each plant. like within 6 months, the south had rotted out. So it's totally inappropriate for it. It's not dryland area, because it's facing south, it's got a lot of dampness, whereas the north, definitely dry. It survived okay, it actually flowered, but it was dead by the end of flowering too. And this is the interesting part. I put temperature monitors on it, and I only had a couple, so it was a very short period. But as you can see, the north facing one, hot hours, middle of the day when you expect it to be hot. Whereas the south side is actually warmed up at night, so it travelled, the temperature had to travel around the dam for that south side to warm up, and it didn't warm up as much as the north side. So you've got to take that into consideration, you know, whether it's native, your natural landscape or your novel landscape. Think about where you're actually planting, where the sun's going, what the shade is it facing northwest? Is it going to be dry during summer all the time, or is it going to be damp? And this is Te Parita, which was one of my sites. As you can see, lovely Mcgaw there. And because the amazing thing, even though you feel like you're miles away from the river, you are basically on a river terrace here. So some of the plants that look quite small, they might be metres deep. I share an office with Peter Heenan at work. He's got a photo of a kowhai from Otago that was in the middle of a paddock. The branches were actually here. Yeah, it's like, why are they here? They should be up further. They dug down and there's 5 metres of trunk below the soil height because of repeated floods, and that tree just keeps on surviving. So you get a lot of that, and if you go to Lowe's Crossing on the other side of the Rakaia, you'll see it there with the Mataga kowhais there, and they are massive trunks, but they would have had repeated flooding. So you've got to take these things into consideration and think where your land is, what you're doing with it. Yeah. So it's Wainui, one of my patches, and good old rabbit droppings. And as Sue say, you know, look at the mix of what's there, what you want. So it's, yeah, just one of, on the north side of this, for my planting, I actually got it fenced, whereas the south side wasn't. So the rabbits came through pretty much in that first week, ate half my plants on the south side, whereas the north was okay. That's the south side, obviously doing really well, great growth. And that's the Leptonella cerulata, and you can see how small it is. But the interesting thing, like, I think I only had 2 rosettes to put in, but a year later it was growing like that. And it actually, if I remember right, it disappears over summer at times, so then it can pop up, so you've got to really search for it. The Aphroides, lovely dried twigs. I actually managed to do some cuttings, which actually took, and I also put some seeds in, which I collected from the university, and they germinated and came up within 6 months, which I was really pleased with. And this is what I said about removing the potting mix. You can see where the pot is up in the top corner there, and the Leptonella is slowly moving out, whereas other sites where there wasn't so much potting mix, it was spreading out a lot further, looking for the nutrients. And protection, use what you've got. If you can't afford new timber and something you've got to make with beehives or whatever, use them, because it's better to have some protection than none. That's it. Thank you. And I'll hand you back to Bex.
Oh, that was great. Yeah, huge thanks to Sue and Paula for coming and sharing their knowledge with us. They're around for any questions should you have any. And as Sue said, she's left her cards here at the front. You can get hold of Paula at the Allen Herbarium at Landcare Research. Any burning questions? Hi.
Hi. Yeah. I was just wondering, so has there been any ways to establish the moss in a new planting?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So the question was, has the moss been established in new plantings and restoration sites? I tried lots of things. I was just talking about it this morning that I made up a moss soup. I got dry moss and I put it in a mixer with water and PVA glue, and I sprayed it on soil, and it grew beautifully in the greenhouse. And so I took it outside into the field and made little greenhouses for it in the field, and it all died. And the way that I managed to actually get it in was, we were lucky in a way that we had a forest coming down that had lots of moss, and so I took a lot of the moss and I used it as weed matting around plants that were going into the ground. And I went back to have a look at them just a few weeks ago, and it started to extend. I also just gathered fragments, just little fragments, and threw it around the place, and that too has started to grow. But obviously it is quite tricky here in the plains with it being so dry. Yeah. Hi.
I'd like to ask about savage lancewood, Pseudopenax ferox. No one's mentioned it today. And what are your thoughts on it growing on the plains, or is it more of a what's its natural?
Personally, I think I'd go more foothills, but Sue, throwing that one to you, doll.
Oh, right. Well, personally, I think that the fierce lancewood is still a fringe, a plant that requires protection, and is naturally found in protected areas. But I have seen a number of plant lists over the last 2 years where people have gone out and thought they'd seen a toothed lancewood seedling, but in actual fact what they were seeing amongst the mix of the berries and the devaricating plants, what they actually seen was the young shoot of New Zealand jasmine, which looks very, very similar, sort of like long with these tooth bits. And that jasmine grows because as a vine over the other shrubs, and it's really important kind of conduit or conducting vine for the lizards. So I'd be inclined to, I'd be going to plant the Caprosma opiqua, the wriggly plants, my Parochia, and the porcupine shrub, and some of these vines, such as the fragrant jasmine, and rather than before I go and put a fierce lancewood in an open space.
Thank you. Do you want to comment on the spread of fierce lancewood in the plains, or what sort of habitat it's?
I've never seen it on the plains.
No, that's right. Foothills.
Usually rocky, cold, or stressful places in the hills.
Okay.
Yeah, but not to say that it always grew there.
No,
That's where it
just
is
where
now.
it is now. That's right, and that's the thing too. Could I just say a question? How much kānuka remnant do you think we have in Waimakariri district?
Oh, that's interesting. I'm eyeballing miles on the front on the front row.
Not a lot.
Yeah.
Not a lot. I know that.
Is it still a permitted activity to remove? No?
No. Talk about vegetation clearance rules. Isn't it?
Mm.
Yeah, no, you shouldn't.
That's good.
But it's just scrub to some people.
Yeah, that's my thought.
Yeah.
A lot of it's gone in the last 10 or 15 years, unfortunately. It doesn't appeal to a lot of people.
So these restoration ideas are really valuable.
Yeah.
Obviously more complicated. I think might just draw it to
Yeah.
close now.
Oh, okay.
Oh, sorry, there's
So,
one.
yeah,
Yes,
any comments on the pros and cons of Waimakariri australis?
Pros and cons.
Con is it?
Ladies.
The pro is it's native. And the swamp
It's
thing.
native,
And the
it's
con is that it covers
lizard
other things.
fodder. Mullenbeckia, it's really good for butterflies.
Australis, the one that's the big tall one.
Ah.
Goes way
Australis
up
is the
tree.
valley. I mean the biggie.
Sue, any
Well,
comments?
I guess I like all the lower ones.
Yeah.
Personally, if I'm doing a restoration, I'd love to get my hands on many beneficial services, but I think when we are have got such a small remnant left on our plains that anything that we do, we should do things that will make it easy both financially, like what can we afford and what can we afford to maintain. So the issue is the maintenance with that particular plant.
Yeah, thank you. So the one down here is around this.
Yeah. I was just looking at all this here. I keep thinking to myself, there's two things I think that threaten all our biodiversity, and they're ignorance and greed. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can't argue with that at all. Yeah.
Perhaps on that philosophical note, John, we'll wind up. Thank you very much to everybody. Thank you very much to the three speakers and to everybody for coming along. That was a real challenge for restoration. It didn't make it any easier, but thank you very much. There is a cup of tea outside or coffee. If you'd like to stay around and talk to each other and ask questions of this